Good evening. This is Tom Heaney, and I want to talk to you briefly about some of the impacts of globalization on adult education. This is part of a much longer presentation that I had put together on globalization and its causes and effects. Let me give you a brief overview of where I'm going with this. First of all, I want to look at what the practice of adult education is in the United States. Not the theory, but the practice, how it is we're actually doing it. And then apply this practice to questions about the economics of education. And then finally, I want to look at some alternative views of capital and globalization, most notably human capital, which has dominance in adult education. Human capital meaning that our students, the people who sit in our classroom are considered to be of economic value because they acquire skills which go out and therefore increase production. And what I'm going to argue is that this notion of human capital is complicated by notions of globalization and underdevelopment in many nations. And so I want to contrast that with social capital and social development models that I believe are better suited to what the philosophy of adult education is all about. First of all, human capital. Human capital, the theory of human capital looks at inputs and outputs. The inputs in education are the cost of education. And the outputs of human capital theory are the wages that the educated person is therefore enabled to earn. And so the theory of human capital would argue, the economic theory of human capital would argue that the inputs are less than the outputs. That is, it costs less to get an education than you actually ultimately gain through your wages. I mean, this does not explain, however, discriminatory results based on race and gender. I mean, the fact that some people, based on race and gender, go through significant educational inputs and do not achieve the outputs in wages that we might expect. And also that there is underdevelopment in highly invested areas, for example, in Appalachia or in West Africa. But the point of human capital is that the principle of it is that the value of it is in its utility. And this theory, or I asked the question, does this theory fit with our experience? Adult education practice actually focuses on the private individual generally. We recruit people one by one to come into our classrooms. And it's done in the context of a capitalist ideology. That is, we learn for earning. We learn in a context in which there is competition. Those who learn more will be more advantaged than those who earn less, and therefore not only competition, but conflict. It also assumes a kind of meritocracy in which the people who have struggled through an education are the ones who achieve the most results. And in claiming that, we also blame the victims, those that are underemployed or unemployed. And so globalization, technology, and international markets are all extremely relevant to this. We might begin by approaching adult education by asking ourselves, what kind of a world do I want to make? Well, we might begin by asking that question, but we often don't. And the fact is that social and global purposes are embedded in our practice, but they're invisible to us. That there are social benefits of our work that are assumed to be an aggregate of the individuals that we develop in our class. We assume that if we are training people to be competent workers and citizens, that somehow is going to be aggregated into an improved society. And so adult education is assumed to develop human capital. Learners are adapted to inevitable social inequities. Theoretically, all consumers shop for the best educational deal they can get, and they exchange their human capital for higher wages. But that's the theory versus the harsh reality. The fact is that female college graduates earn less than male high school dropouts. That black college men earn a little more than white men with a high school degree. McDonald's uses icons on their cash register in response to or perhaps creating illiteracy. And we witness everywhere the exploitation of cheap and non-unionized labor. We're entering into a marketplace that is governed by wage arbitrage. And that's what I think we are all experiencing. What are the global realities of practice? We teach inevitabilities, the things that we actually teach in the classroom. We teach about global recession. We teach about this is a competitive marketplace that we're moving into. So we teach about competition. We teach about a nomadic lifestyle where you can expect to move from one job to another many times in your lifetime. And we also teach destabilization. That is, we talk about the fact how destabilized the market is. But what we ignore in our teaching, what we do not teach, are the ways in which markets are in fact manipulated, the way in which workers are exploited. We don't teach about globalized corporations and the impact that they have on our market in the United States. And we don't teach about the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. Who benefits and who doesn't? We don't ask that question very often. Andragogy, adult education, introduces soft controls in the guise of self-direction. You know, Ian Batiste always said that self-direction is neither possible nor desirable. It's not possible because the agenda of the global economy is embedded in our practice. It's not desirable because if we have to counter the global agenda one by one as individuals, then we've lost the synergy and the collective energy of organization. And so our agenda, our hidden agenda, favors global capital. Those with the most can afford more. And the meritocracy that we create through our educational efforts disguise the factors of race, gender, and class. Why is this important? I mean, because we need to ask, is adult education consumption? Is it an investment, or is it something else? Human capital focuses on homo economicus, that how we as individuals are acting for personal gain. And our investment in human capital grows the economy. And that the differences in earnings between us and between various students in our classroom are the results of differences in ability and education. So we rationalize the inequality that our society produces. There's a problem with the investment metaphor. By the investment metaphor, I mean the metaphor that we invest in education and that we therefore make greater profits over a lifetime. The problem is that it ignores global inequality. It privileges profitable education. The inputs and the outputs are themselves problematic because there are real questions about whether or not you do earn over the lifetime the cost of mounting student debt that's incurred in the first early years of education. And the question is, who are really the investors in this educational enterprise? It turns out that we are, as individual students, through tuition and other means. And so what is the alternative to this? The alternative is adult education, which is neither consumption nor investment in human capital. The alternative is the notion of social capital. What is the difference between human capital and social capital? Human capital focuses on the individual in the classroom. Social capital focuses on building networks and relationships. Human capital focuses on the inevitability and the persuasiveness of information, whereas social capital proclaims that information is socially constructed. We're constructing knowledge all the time, and we're constructing it in somebody's interest, not necessarily in the learner's interest. In human capital, the input is the cost of education. In social capital, the input is mutual engagement, working with others to learn. In human capital, the output is individual wages. In social capital, the output is the quality of life. So adult education's agenda can become social capital. The learned and practiced abilities of a community to create an independent life world, to create a stable subsistence economy, and to negotiate social construction, to negotiate common meanings and culture and expectations. And capital, therefore, is not held by an individual, but by individuals in relation to each other. So we learn through education to act locally and think globally. Effective action is grounded in an understanding of the problem. I give you the example of Highlander. In the 1930s, began organizing coal and textile. Textile mills avoid unions by moving to Mexico. Highlander entered into solidarity at the time of the Bhopal disaster, when Union Carbide gas leak in India killed 3,000 in 2 weeks and 8,000 more in subsequent years. And Union Carbide had a plant in Tennessee, which was right near Highlander. What we need to learn to do is to exploit the dysfunctions in our society. The role of social media in the Middle East, for example, the internet in Egypt, China, which followed suit by shutting down Google in Beijing. It used to be freedom of the press only for those who owned one. Now newspapers are closing, and a large proportion of the population get their news from blogs and Twitter and online. So we move towards a social adult education. Change the focus from the private individual to the citizen by teaching for a global consciousness, by situating the lives of the communities we serve in the context of the lives of others globally. We maximize life, liberty, and estate. We do not simply focus on homo economicus, but we focus on the citizen, on interdependence and public accountability, on self-realization, not self-preservation. And so in this, there can be an education and training alliance. We serve no one if we ignore the global economic realities. It's not enough for conscientization to occur, for our consciousness to be awakened, or that learners understand the systemic exploitation of markets and labor. Learners need the skills to build and maintain a sustainable world. There are gaps between adult education practice, which is dominated by human capital, and training, which is dominated by behaviorism. And so what we want is a socially responsible adult education, a life world basis for meaning, social learning for citizenship, promotion of democracy, and skills for modest utopian visions. Thank you, and I wish that we had time to go into more about the impact of globalization and technology on adult education.